It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Maya, a young woman living in the city, was walking down the street after finishing her shift at a local cafe. She was heading to her car, looking forward to a peaceful evening at home. As she passed by a row of stores, she noticed a police officer standing near the corner, talking to a few people. Maya didn't think much of it at first, as she had seen officers around the neighborhood before, doing their routine patrols. But as she got closer, she could feel something wasn't quite right. The officer, tall and imposing, stood with his arms crossed, staring directly at her. There was an air of authority around him, but something about his gaze made her uncomfortable. Maya tried to ignore him and keep walking, but as she took a few steps past him, the officer suddenly stepped in her way. "Where do you think you're going, miss?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Maya was taken aback, unsure how to respond. She didn't know the officer and had never spoken to him before. "Just heading to my car," she said politely, trying to step around him. The officer didn't move. Instead, he stepped even closer, blocking her path. "You sure about that? You look suspicious to me." Maya's heart began to race. There was no reason for him to be treating her like this, and she could feel the tension rising. She knew something was wrong but wasn't sure why. "I'm just trying to go home," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her nerves beginning to build. The officer smirked, clearly not satisfied with her answer. "You think you can just walk around here, acting like you own the place?" he said, his voice growing louder now. Maya could hear a few people behind her begin to murmur, sensing the confrontation. Maya's stomach twisted in a knot. She had dealt with uncomfortable situations before, but this felt different. The officer's words had a certain edge, as if he was looking for a reason to make trouble. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm just going to my car," Maya repeated, more firmly this time. But instead of stepping aside, the officer's face hardened. "I don't think I like your attitude," he said, taking a step toward her. Maya felt a chill run through her. She had seen officers in the neighborhood before, but never one who seemed to be so eager to start a problem. It was as if he was just looking for an excuse to assert control over her, and that was something Maya wasn't about to let happen. The crowd of people around them grew a little larger, as they watched with curiosity, but no one moved to intervene. It was just her and the officer now. Maya knew she had to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. His words, his actions, everything about this moment felt wrong. Just as she tried to step around him again, the officer raised his voice even higher. "You better watch your step, miss," he warned, his eyes cold and unblinking. "I don't tolerate disrespect." Maya's heartbeat quickened, and she felt a rising anger. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. Why was this officer treating her like this? For no reason at all. She thought about the many stories she'd heard of people being treated unfairly, and in that moment, she realized that she wasn't just going to let him intimidate her. Maya's heart raced in her chest as the officer continued to block her path. She could feel her nerves getting the best of her, but she was determined not to let him intimidate her. There was no reason for this officer to treat her this way. She had done nothing wrong. The officer stood a little taller, his stance more forceful now. "I said you better watch your step," he repeated, his voice low and threatening. He was no longer just questioning her. There was an anger in his eyes now, something that made Maya feel uneasy. She had no idea why he was so upset with her, but she knew she couldn't just let this continue. Maya took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm just trying to go home," she said again, her voice steady but her hands now trembling slightly. "Please move out of my way." But the officer didn't step aside. Instead, he took a step forward, narrowing the distance between them. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he sneered, his words sharp and full of arrogance. Maya's instincts told her to back away, to just get in her car and drive off. But something inside her refused to let him continue to treat her like this. It was as if every story she had heard of injustice, of people being pushed around by those who were supposed to protect them, flashed in her mind. She couldn't let this moment slip away. Before she could say anything more, the officer's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing her arm tightly. Maya gasped in surprise. The officer's grip was firm, and she could feel his fingers digging into her skin. She wasn't sure what to do. It felt wrong, but she didn't want to make the situation worse. "Let go of me," she exclaimed, trying to pull away. The officer didn't budge. Instead, his grip tightened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the officer muttered under his breath. "I'm trying to help you, but you're making it difficult." Maya felt a wave of frustration and anger. How could he say he was trying to help her when he was the one causing all the trouble? She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the people nearby just watched, some looking nervous, others unsure of what to do. The officer suddenly raised his other hand, and in an instant, before Maya could react, he slapped her arm away. But this wasn't just a slap. It was a hit, a harsh push that sent a jolt through her body. Maya's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe it. This officer had just hit her. The moment was surreal. Everything seemed to slow down, as if the world around her was waiting for her to do something. Maya's mind raced. She had never expected something like this to happen. She had always trusted the system, believing that people in positions of power would do the right thing. But this officer wasn't behaving the way he should. With her arm stinging from the hit, Maya looked up at the officer, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. She had had enough. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about standing up against the unfairness that so many had suffered through before her. The officer had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. For a moment, everything felt still. The air around them was thick with tension, and Maya could feel every muscle in her body tighten as she made a decision. She wasn't going to walk away this time, not when it felt like she was being treated unfairly for no reason. Maya took a step back, breathing deeply. She knew she had to be careful, but she also knew she couldn't let this go. The officer was about to find out that Maya was not the kind of person to just walk away when pushed too far. Maya stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Her arm still stung from the officer's harsh shove, but her anger was starting to replace the shock. She couldn't just let him treat her like this. She had to stand up for herself, not just for her own dignity, but for everyone who had ever been pushed around by someone in power. The officer was still standing in front of her, his expression hard and unyielding. But Maya wasn't afraid anymore. Something inside her had shifted. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure he knew that what he had done was wrong. With a deep breath, she straightened her posture. The people around her had started to whisper, and she could feel their eyes on her, but she ignored them. This wasn't about them. It was about the officer in front of her. She had the right to stand her ground, and she wasn't going to let him take that away from her. "Listen," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've had enough of this. You don't get to treat me like this. You have no right to touch me, and you certainly don't have the right to bully me into anything." The officer narrowed his eyes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm just trying to do my job, miss. You should be thankful I'm even talking to you." Maya shook her head. His words were full of arrogance, but she wasn't backing down. "You're not doing your job. You're abusing your power," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And you're not going to intimidate me into being quiet." For a brief moment, the officer looked taken aback. Perhaps he hadn't expected her to speak up like this. Maybe he thought she would be too scared to do anything. But Maya wasn't afraid anymore. The more he spoke, the more she realized how much she had been holding back for far too long. She had dealt with moments in her life where she had to bite her tongue, moments where she felt like she couldn't speak up for fear of being punished or ignored. But now, standing there in front of this officer, Maya knew she couldn't remain silent anymore. She could feel her heart beating faster, not because of fear, but because of something else, something stronger. It was the realization that she had power in this moment. She didn't need to fight back physically. Her words, her confidence, her ability to stand up for what was right. These were the things that made her powerful. As she stared at the officer, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe he hadn't expected her to stand up for herself. Maybe he thought she would cower under his control. But Maya wasn't backing down. "Move," she said, her tone unwavering. "I'm going home now, and you are going to step aside and let me leave." The officer opened his mouth as if to argue, but then he paused. For a brief moment, Maya thought he might try to escalate things again, but instead, he seemed to hesitate, perhaps realizing that she wasn't just a helpless person he could push around. The tension in the air was thick, and Maya could feel it, but she didn't let it shake her. She stood her ground, refusing to let fear take over. This wasn't just about getting home anymore. It was about making sure that no one could make her feel small, no matter who they were. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the officer took a step back. He didn't say anything more, but for Maya, that small gesture was enough. It was the first sign that she had won this moment. She hadn't used force. She hadn't tried to fight him physically. She had stood up for herself, and that had made all the difference. With one last look at the officer, Maya walked past him, her head held high. The crowd around her was still watching, but she didn't care anymore. As she reached her car, she couldn't help but smile, realizing that she had done something powerful today. She had fought back, not with fists, but with her voice. And that was more than enough. Maya walked quickly to her car, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than ever. She had stood up for herself in a way she never thought she could, and that felt empowering. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and she could hear a few quiet murmurs behind her, but she didn't let that distract her. Her steps were steady, each one more confident than the last. But then, before she could reach the door of her car, she heard a heavy voice behind her. "Hold on a second." It was the officer again. Maya didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew that voice too well by now. The tone was still the same, demanding and full of authority. But this time, there was an edge to it. The officer had clearly not given up. "Move out of my way," Maya said, without even looking at him. She could feel the tension rising in the air once more. The moment that had started with so much uncertainty was now becoming something else entirely. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her again. "I told you to stop," the officer repeated, his voice louder this time. There was anger in his voice now, and Maya could hear his steps as he came closer. He wasn't about to let her go so easily. Maya's hand instinctively reached for the handle of the car door. Her fingers touched it, but before she could open it, the officer was standing right behind her, blocking her way again. The situation had gone from uncomfortable to tense in a matter of seconds. "Why are you doing this?" Maya said, turning to face him now. Her voice was steady, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. "I've done nothing wrong. I've tried to stay calm, but you keep pushing me." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he said, his tone harsh. "You think you can just walk around here acting like you own the place?" Maya's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her voice calm. "No one owns the place, and I don't owe you anything. I've done nothing but try to leave, but you're the one who's making this difficult." For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. His chest rose and fell as he breathed deeply, clearly frustrated. Maya stood her ground, not backing down an inch. She wasn't going to let him dictate how this moment ended. She had control over her own actions, and that was enough. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer took a step back. It wasn't much of a step, but it was enough. For the first time, Maya saw a crack in his confidence. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been before. Maya didn't wait for him to speak again. She pushed open the car door and slid inside, locking it behind her. She could still hear the officer's footsteps as he walked away, but she didn't look back. The door was shut. The confrontation was over. For now. As she sat in the car, Maya let out a deep breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. Her hands were still a little shaky, but the adrenaline was starting to wear off. She had faced him down and won, simply by standing firm and refusing to back down. She felt a strange mix of relief and pride in that moment, as if she had just taken a huge step toward something bigger than herself. But Maya knew this wasn't over. The officer might have backed off for now, but she couldn't forget what had just happened. This was a moment she couldn't let go of. There were still questions to answer, and still much to be done to make sure this didn't happen again, to her or anyone else. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had just happened. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Maya drove down the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The events that had just unfolded still played over and over in her mind, like a video that wouldn't stop replaying. She had stood her ground against the officer, but something inside her told her this wasn't just about that one moment. It was bigger than that. As she turned a corner, she could still feel the weight of the confrontation. The officer had tried to bully her, but she hadn't let him. At first, she had been unsure, nervous even, but now that it was over, she felt a new sense of strength inside her. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt in control. She could still hear the officer's words in her mind. "You think you can just walk away?" he had said. That question kept echoing in her thoughts. It wasn't just a question about her walking away. It was about how much power he assumed he had over her. How many times had she, or others, been in a situation where someone with authority tried to control them unjustly? It wasn't just about this officer. It was about all the times people had been pushed around, ignored, or dismissed. She wasn't the first person to experience this kind of treatment, and she wouldn't be the last. But she had learned something important today, something that made her feel both empowered and determined. It wasn't about fighting with force or getting angry. It was about standing up for herself in a calm and assertive way. As she drove, Maya noticed the quiet of the city around her. The usual noise of busy streets and honking cars seemed distant. She realized she needed to do more. She needed to make sure what happened wasn't just forgotten, and that the officer knew his behavior wasn't acceptable. It wasn't just about one encounter. This was a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. When she pulled into her driveway, Maya sat in the car for a few moments, taking a deep breath. She had proven something to herself today. But that wasn't enough. There were still questions in the air. Was the officer going to face any consequences for his actions? Would anyone else stand up the way she had? Maya knew that things couldn't stay like this. She got out of the car and walked toward her front door, but her thoughts were racing. She remembered the faces of the people who had watched, some of them filming the confrontation. They had seen it all. They had seen what happened when someone who was supposed to protect others used their power for the wrong reasons. And yet, no one had stepped in to help her. It wasn't their responsibility to get involved, but it made her think. Maya knew she needed to take action. Maybe it wasn't enough just to walk away. Maybe it was time to make a bigger statement. She needed to talk to someone who could help her make sure this didn't happen again. She needed to speak up not just for herself, but for anyone who might find themselves in the same situation. This wasn't the world she wanted to live in, where people could be treated unfairly by those meant to serve them. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her friend Sarah, checking in to see how things went. Maya smiled a little. She could always count on Sarah to support her. But right now, Maya wasn't sure how to explain everything. She needed to process what had happened, figure out what her next steps would be. She knew that standing up to the officer had been just the first step. Now, she had to keep going. The next morning, Maya woke up with a mixture of feelings swirling inside her. She had thought about the previous day's events all night, replaying them over and over in her mind. The confrontation with the officer had been intense, but now, in the light of a new day, she felt more certain of her actions. She had stood her ground. She hadn't allowed him to control her. But the question lingered. What now? As Maya went about her morning routine, she couldn't shake the thought that the officer had underestimated her. He had tried to intimidate her, to force her into a situation where he could control the narrative. But what he hadn't realized was that his own arrogance had been his downfall. He had expected her to be afraid, to back down, to do whatever he told her to do. When she didn't, he had no idea how to react. Maya had stayed calm, refusing to let his words or actions rattle her. And that had made all the difference. In the end, it was him who had backed down, not her. She could almost feel a sense of satisfaction in that realization. The officer had thought he could use his authority to force her into submission, but instead he had exposed his own weakness. His need to control, his lack of respect for others, had ultimately been his undoing. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, Maya's phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, her best friend, asking if she was okay. Maya smiled and quickly typed back, telling her she was doing better, though there was still a lot on her mind. Sarah had always been there for her, and she was grateful to have someone to talk to. But Maya knew that she couldn't just keep this to herself. What happened to her wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. It was about the way people in power, especially law enforcement, sometimes abuse that power. It was about how many others had been treated the same way or worse. She realized that her story could be a catalyst for change. Maya decided to go to the local community center later that afternoon to speak with someone. She didn't know exactly who, but she knew she needed to take action. She needed to make sure that what had happened to her didn't go unnoticed, and that the officer understood that he couldn't get away with treating people like that. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for accountability. As she drove to the community center, her mind raced with thoughts of what she would say. What if the officer denied everything? What if no one believed her? But Maya pushed those fears aside. She had video evidence of the incident, footage taken by bystanders. She had proof, and that made her feel more confident. This wasn't just her word against his. This was a story that needed to be heard. When she arrived at the community center, she was greeted by a friendly woman at the front desk. After explaining her situation, the woman directed her to a social worker who specialized in cases like hers. Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. There were people who wanted to help, who understood that what had happened wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was a serious issue. Sitting down with the social worker, Maya shared her story. The woman listened carefully, nodding in understanding. "You did the right thing," she said. "Not everyone has the courage to stand up in that moment, but you didn't back down, and that's powerful." Maya felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. Finally, someone was listening, someone who understood the significance of her actions. It wasn't just about this one officer. It was about standing up against something bigger, something that affected many people. And Maya was determined to make sure her voice was heard. Over the next few days, Maya kept thinking about the meeting at the community center. The support she had received from the social worker and the people there made her realize that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had made the right choice to speak up, and now she needed to keep pushing forward. The social worker had given her information about how to file a formal report about the officer's behavior. She had also connected her with a lawyer who could help if the situation escalated. Maya knew that standing up for herself wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a process. She needed to make sure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen again to anyone else. As Maya prepared to go back to work, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "I'm so proud of you." Sarah wrote, "I heard the news. You're making a real difference." Maya smiled as she read the message. She felt proud too, but she also knew that the real work had just begun. She wasn't in this for attention or praise. She was doing this because she believed in fairness. Maya thought about all the people she had spoken to in the past few days. Friends, strangers, and even a few colleagues at work who had expressed their support for her. It was clear that the problem wasn't just hers. It was something that affected a lot of people. One afternoon, Maya got a call from the local news station. They had heard about her story from someone in the community and wanted to interview her. At first, she wasn't sure if she wanted to be on television. She didn't want the attention to distract from the real issue. But then she realized that this was her chance to speak to a larger audience. If her story could make even one person see how important it was to stand up to injustice, then it would be worth it. Maya agreed to the interview, and the next day, a reporter and a camera crew came to her apartment. The moment the cameras turned on, Maya felt a little nervous, but she quickly remembered why she was doing this. She wasn't just sharing her experience for herself. She was sharing it for everyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated. The reporter asked her to recount what happened with the officer, and Maya told the story as calmly and clearly as she could. "What happened to me isn't just about one officer," she said. "It's about people standing up for what's right. No one should feel afraid or helpless when they're treated unfairly." After the interview, Maya felt a sense of relief. She had told her story, and the response from the community was overwhelming. People reached out to her, thanking her for her courage and for speaking out. Others shared their own stories, telling her how they had been mistreated by people in positions of power. Maya realized how much bigger this issue was than she had initially thought. It wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about a system that needed to change. A few weeks later, the officer involved in the incident was placed on administrative leave while an investigation was conducted. Maya didn't know what would happen to him, but she hoped that this would send a message. People in power needed to be held accountable for their actions. Maya kept thinking back to that moment when she had stood her ground, when she refused to let the officer intimidate her. It was a turning point for her, but it was also a turning point for the community. She had proven that one person could make a difference, and now others were starting to see that they, too, could stand up for what was right. The weeks after Maya's story went public felt like a whirlwind. The interview with the local news station had brought a lot of attention, and people in her community started to look at her differently. Some saw her as a hero, while others admired her courage to stand up against injustice. Maya had never imagined that speaking out about her experience would lead to such a strong response, but it was clear that her actions had touched many people. At work, Maya's colleagues started treating her with more respect. Many of them, who had previously kept to themselves, began to open up to her. They expressed their support and told her how much they admired her for not backing down. "You showed us what it means to stand up for yourself," one of her coworkers, Emma, said one morning as they chatted by the coffee machine. "I think we all need to be more like you, not just when it comes to big things, but in everyday situations too." Maya smiled, feeling grateful for the encouragement, but she also realized that it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a culture of respect and accountability, where people didn't feel afraid to speak out when something wasn't right. The support she received from her colleagues and community members gave her the strength to keep going, but it also reminded her of the importance of standing up for what's right in every situation, no matter how small or large. As the investigation into the officer's actions continued, Maya found herself thinking more about the broader issue. She had become an unwitting spokesperson for change, and with that came a sense of responsibility. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt silenced or ignored. Every time someone reached out to her to share their story, Maya felt more determined to continue her work. One day, she received an invitation to attend a community meeting about police reform. The invitation came from a local activist group that had heard about her story and wanted her to be part of the conversation. Maya knew that this was an opportunity to be involved in something bigger than herself, something that could truly make a difference. She decided to attend, feeling both nervous and excited. When she arrived at the meeting, she was surprised by the number of people who were there. It wasn't just local residents. There were representatives from various organizations, community leaders, and even a few local politicians. The room was filled with people who were passionate about making a change, and Maya felt both honored and humbled to be part of the discussion. The meeting was intense but productive. People spoke about their own experiences with unfair treatment and shared ideas for how to improve the relationship between law enforcement and the community. Maya listened carefully, nodding as others spoke, but when it was her turn to speak, she found herself feeling more confident than ever before. I never expected my story to become a symbol for change, Maya began, her voice steady and clear. But I'm here today because I believe that change is possible. We need to hold people in positions of power accountable, but we also need to support each other and stand up for what's right. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She wasn't just a person who had experienced something difficult. She was now part of a movement that was working to bring about real change. As the meeting ended, Maya left with a sense of purpose. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. There were others just like her, people who were willing to speak out, to demand better, and to make sure that their voices were heard. For Maya, this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, fairness, and respect wasn't over. But as long as people like her were willing to stand up and speak out, there was hope for a better future. As the days turned into weeks, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time she thought back to the moment she stood her ground. It had started as a simple decision to defend herself, but it had become something much bigger. What had once been a personal experience had grown into a story that resonated with many others. Maya was no longer just an individual fighting for herself. She had become part of something greater, a movement toward fairness and justice. One afternoon, Maya sat in her favorite cafe, reflecting on everything that had happened. The familiar sound of coffee machines and quiet chatter filled the air, but for once, she wasn't distracted. She was thinking about how far she had come. She had never imagined that speaking out after that encounter with the officer would lead to so much. It had brought her into conversations about change, brought people together, and opened up opportunities for her to make a real difference. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "I saw the article. You're doing amazing things. Proud of you." Maya smiled and quickly typed back, "Thanks. It's still a bit overwhelming, but it feels good to know that we're making a difference." She paused, thinking about how many times Sarah had been there for her. We all have a part to play in this. She had been invited to speak at a community event the following week, and Maya was excited, but also nervous. She had never thought of herself as a public speaker, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't about her. It was about all the people who had shared their stories with her, the voices that had been ignored or dismissed. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was speaking for all of them. That night, she spent hours preparing her speech. She didn't want to just share what had happened to her. She wanted to speak about the larger issue, the need for change in the way people were treated, especially by those who held power. She thought about the stories others had shared with her, stories of unfair treatment and struggles that felt too familiar. She knew that things could be different, but it would take everyone working together to make it happen. The day of the event, Maya stood before a crowd of people, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. As she stepped up to the microphone, she took a deep breath. This was her moment, not just to speak, but to make sure that others understood why it was so important for everyone to stand up for what's right. "I never thought that one simple act of standing up for myself would lead to this," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But what I've learned is that each of us has the power to create change. It doesn't take violence or anger. It takes courage and conviction. It takes the willingness to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those who can't." The room was silent, every eye focused on her. Maya could feel the energy in the room shift as she spoke. The support and encouragement from the crowd were overwhelming, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The change she had wanted to see was happening, and she was proud to be part of it. As the event ended and people approached her to thank her for sharing her story, Maya realized that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. She would continue to speak out, continue to advocate for fairness, and continue to push for change. And no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she knew that she would never stop fighting for what was right. Maya had learned that true power wasn't in forcing others to bend to your will. It was in standing up, speaking your truth, and inspiring others to do the same. And in that, Maya knew she had found her purpose.